Greg, thanks for also taking the time to talk to us about Cobalt. It's obviously been a pretty horrific 14 days where I'd say on the metal market, nickel's probably grabbed a lot of the attention in the battery space for obvious reasons. But obviously I understand that there is some cobalt production in Russia, but in terms of the general geopolitical environment at the moment, how's the cobalt price faring, and how's it holding up given the myriad of different events that are happening around the world?
Yeah, well, Cobalt really has been on a bit of a bull run since late last year, driven by obviously bullish demand prospects this year, and also the ongoing global logistics issues that have continued to kind of constrain the ability to move material around the world. So really, we've seen a bit of a bull run in the metal market, particularly since the back end of 2021, and that's only really kind of been further supported really by the issues that we've seen in the last 2 weeks with the Ukraine crisis. So while Russia's footprint in the cobalt market is pretty small, particularly when you compare it to nickel, it's actually having a further kind of supportive impact on cobalt prices, and we're now rapidly seeing we're seeing cobalt rapidly approaching the $40 a pound mark. So yeah, it's kind of just adding to this upward pressure on cobalt prices.
Would it be okay just to quickly break down sort of where, obviously I know DRC is obviously the main one, 60-70% depending on the year, but where else is cobalt coming from? I know there's a bit coming from Russia. From my understanding, it's mainly the riskier jurisdictions. Is that right?
Yeah, outside the DRC, it really is quite scattered. There's cobalt coming out of it's outside. So the DRC, it's mined as a byproduct of copper in the copper belt. Other jurisdictions, it tends to be mined as a byproduct of nickel. So you find it in a lot of regions which are big nickel producers like Canada, Australia, Madagascar, Finland. There's a lot of different regions that produce some cobalt, more on the metal side actually, with cobalt hydroxide tending to be mined in cobalt ore tending to be processed into cobalt hydroxide in the DRC, which is then kind of exported to China. So outside of the DRC, it's there's a lot of smaller kind of players in the market.
I think we saw a while ago some of the battery manufacturers starting to substitute cobalt out as much as they could in a way. I think it seems fairly warranted given the political risks around the areas that it's coming from, not all the areas, but is there a chance that we could see potentially a lot more of this going on over the next year or two, or over the next 10 years? Are we starting to really see that battery manufacturers just don't want any cobalt whatsoever, and they're starting to substitute for other metals?
I mean, there's certainly moves to minimise their exposure to cobalt, or even kind of cut it out of their battery cells completely. I mean, Tesla being the obvious example of that, at their battery day in late 2020, they announced they were looking to go to kind of cells without cobalt, which were high nickel, and also using LFP. But then you look at, if you actually break down, looking at their impact report, they still say that their absolute cobalt demand is going to increase over the next decade as the growth in sales and cell production kind of outpaces the efforts to reduce cobalt. So that's what we're really seeing across the industry, is the fact that although there is this move to reduce reliance on cobalt and minimize its use in cells, in terms of the absolute demand numbers, it's going to continue increasing. So there may be a point where we do actually, eventually cobalt is phased out, but we're seeing, even with the deployment of high nickel cells, such as 811, and the industry is looking to go even more nickel rich than that, kind of a 9 series cell, which is 9 parts nickel and 0.5 part cobalt and 0.5 part manganese. There's safety issues around that, because cobalt is critical for maintaining the structure of the battery cathode. So we've seen a number of kind of fires and associated with the deployment of 811, particularly in China, and a lot of the major cell producers have actually delayed the deployment of these nickel-rich cells this year because of the safety issues. So it's not a kind of easy transition towards phasing cobalt out. So in our view, cobalt is here to stay, and we maintain that it's going to play a critical role in the electrification of the transport industry for some time to come.
Okay, so demand's going to increase at least for the next 10 years or so, but from I gather from sort of what you're saying there. In terms of reserves in the ground and actual supply that we know about, is there enough that cobalt that we are aware of in reserves to meet this demand moving forward over the next 10 years or so?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, if you look at actual reserves, I think the US Geological Survey estimate is around 7.6 million tons of cobalt globally. Obviously, it's a different question from just reserves to actually getting it out of the ground and into an EV. From our perspective, we are seeing structural deficits emerge in the cobalt market by the mid 2020s. Driven by the kind of ramp up in growth from the electric vehicle industry. Now, we are also seeing, particularly from Chinese mining companies in the DRC, ramping up cobalt production. And then we're also seeing a wave of new supply coming out of Indonesia as the ramp up of nickel operations there, where cobalt is produced as a byproduct, but because of the scale of new nickel supply in Indonesia, but we really see Indonesia emerge really from very minimal footprint in the cobalt supply chain to the second largest producer very rapidly in the next couple of years. So I think by 2023 we would see Indonesia emerging as the second largest producer globally. So yeah, there are these structural deficits emerging. It's just whether those deficits certainly could lead to substitution towards other chemistries such as LFP. But it's it remains to be seen whether the industry can kind of match the growth in demand.
One of the things I have been hearing recently is that an increase in manganese might help with these flammable issues. There seems to be an abundance of manganese around the world. It's in lots of jurisdictions. I think there's about 300 years of supply. Is that a contender? Do you think that some battery manufacturers are now looking at I know the high purity sulfate is a bit harder to produce or process, but what's it looking like in terms of substitution for cobalt? Obviously, if nickel on its own or with very, very low quantities of nickel and manganese can basically make it flammable, what's the answer in terms of substituting it for other metals?
Yeah, I mean, Volkswagen really have state their claim, and they've said they plan to use the high manganese cells. I think the issue you have at the moment is that these cells and these battery chemistries aren't actually qualified yet into the automotive supply chains of the likes of VW, and that's still some way that will take a few years for that process to kind of finish. So it's certainly a kind of hopeful technology, but I think the thing with the high manganese cells is really they're going to be displacing the kind of mid-level NCM chemistries such as 523, 622, and LFP to a certain degree as well. So we don't really see that kind of high manganese chemistry actually being able to rival the nickel-rich chemistries of the 811s or the 9 series cells. So, but I mean, essentially, we do believe that we're going to need all variations of battery chemistry to meet the growth in demand in EVs, particularly if EVs continue surprising to the upside, which they have done over the kind of last 12 to 18 months. So it's certainly a hopeful technology, but I think it's some way yet to kind of being deployed on a mass market scale. So
the cobalt really is, in absolute terms, it's really required for the larger battery packs, so things that are going to be used in transport vehicles or anything sort of from that sort of scale. Is that right? So we really can't get away from not using the cobalt in those situations?
there's moves, there's certainly ambitions to do so, and I think that the issue you have is that it's been stated that certain automakers, particularly like the likes of Tesla, want to remove cobalt altogether. I think as they move to the more nickel-rich chemistries, their exposure to the cobalt market will become more minimal anyway. So it becomes a kind of cost-benefit analysis of whether, for the actual benefits that the cobalt provides from a safety perspective, is it actually worth actually removing that tiny little bit of cobalt from the cell completely, when it actually does play a kind of a critical role. So I think we'll see cobalt actually stay kind of maintain its position as a critical battery raw material for some time to come. Not to say that it won't, that kind of transition towards cobalt-free, nickel-rich cells won't ever happen, but I think particularly this decade we do see cobalt maintaining that position. I think also you have to kind of factor in the fact that for a region like the DRC, where much of the population is actually reliant on the income generated from mining, is it the best solution to kind of wash our hands with cobalt completely? There's obviously a myriad of issues surrounding the kind of the mining industry in the DRC and Africa, but I don't believe it's kind of responsible to actually cut cobalt out completely and kind of distance ourselves, because it's easier for the likes of Tesla to actually do that. I think there has to be an understanding that that we need to kind of engage with these regions and make mining safer and more kind of done in a more responsible manner.
Who would you envision would be able to do that? Would it be the manufacturers themselves or external mining companies to lend expertise? Or
I mean, we're certainly seeing across the industry, and this is obviously not just in the cobalt market, it's kind of across all commodity markets and beyond that as well, really, that there is a heightened kind of appreciation of ESG as a and the need to improve environmental standards, human rights standards. So I think we're certainly seeing really the downstream consumers actually starting to engage with the upstream side of the market, and rather than there being that disconnect between downstream consumers and upstream producers, they are now kind of converging, and the industry is now as a whole engaging in these regions to improve standards. And we're also seeing there's loads of initiatives such as like the Fair Cobalt Alliance, which are helping to improve standards on the ground, and also there's hope that the technologies such as the blockchain technology can be used to improve transparency and traceability of cobalt across the globe and across the cobalt supply chain. I mean, there's a long way to go, and more needs to be done, but it's certainly there's certainly more industry engagement on that side of the kind of upstream raw material side of the market.
No, I hope you're right in a way. It's obviously I know the DRC are rich in many metals, but so long as the mining companies can mine it responsibly, it would be a shame to cut off a source of revenue for them. Just quickly summarise the market in terms of where we're going here. It sounds like demand's increasing, supply is fairly steady, maybe increasing slightly from what you're saying there, and the pricing is ticking up quite nicely, almost reaching $40. And I presume you guys are potentially forecasting that to increase further.
Yeah, I mean, I think the supply this year and next year, there will be sufficient supply. That we're seeing an increase in production, particularly in the DRC. The issue you have is that due to the disruptions with logistics globally, I think a lot of that material is actually is being slowed down, and the actual flow of material from Africa to China is much delayed. So while maybe the actual, in terms of supply and demand dynamics,
Essentially, over the next 6 months, hopefully supply issues will get sorted. We'll then move into a scenario where we might see a correction.
Yeah, but I don't think it won't be a substantial correction. It will be, I think at the moment, the price is maybe not reflective of the fundamentals, but the fundamentals are still strong. So it's if it does correct, it won't come crashing down like it did in 2018. It will be a bit more of a slower and it will settle at a kind of a higher level than we've seen over the last few years.
Perfect. All right, great. Thank you again for taking the time to have a chat with us. It's been a pleasure.